Well, I was born in Mount Sterling, Kentucky, and I grew up in Florence, Kentucky, which isn't far from here, about 65 miles north, and went to high school there, and then went to college at UK, which is just about 25 miles east of here. And so I literally haven't strayed far from the nest, and really didn't leave Kentucky until I started this job, to be honest, because you know, we just didn't do a lot of traveling. But so I'm a Kentucky born and bred kid working in a industry that's been around for quite a while. So kind of happy that worked out that way. Bourbon originated it really wasn't even called bourbon at the time. It was a whiskey, and people in this area known as Bourbon County. Bourbon County was all of northeastern Kentucky was all Bourbon County at one time, and the whiskey was made in that area, and it literally started by people ordering the whiskey downriver, and downriver I mean down the Mississippi, and they would load it in these barrels that had been cleaned, sanitized by charring them. And then by the time they got them, it took about 6 or 7 months to get all the way down to Mississippi. And in 7 months' time, it would turn a really dark bourbon color. And we have examples of that here and you know, in 7 months' time, that product's a pretty good product. And, but the problem was they ordered a clear spirit and wondered what's going on. They would call up and say, hey, what's going on? And not call, but they would send message and say, you know, what's the deal? And next thing you know, they liked it. Same way with the aged bourbon now, and they liked it, and the market just caught on, and they would specifically order the clear spirit from Bourbon County, and you know, that had been aged in these barrels, and so it would pick up this color and this flavor from the wood, and they shortened it up over time. Instead of whiskey from Bourbon County, they would call it bourbon whiskey, and then eventually, you know, legally it's known as bourbon whiskey. In 1964, Congress passed the law that states that bourbon has to be made in the United States, and we have to have all these regulations based on what bourbon is. We have to have 51% corn. It has to be distilled at less than 160 proof, and aged in a brand new white oak barrel, and made here in the United States. And all those things are designed to protect the product. So, so the flavor is basically protected. Now, each distillery makes its own product and stays within the legal limits, but through processing and production, you can make it taste a little different. So each distillery makes a little different product, but it's all good, and it's all kind of a protected product in the United States. It's one of the few things that the United States makes that is protected like that.
You spoke of this accidental discovery that bourbon improved with age. When roughly did that happen?
That was around the late 1700s, around 1780, 1785, somewhere around there. And we actually have records of shipping product down the Mississippi to New Orleans. And the nice thing for us is our parent company is from New Orleans. So we have a long history of connection between New Orleans and Kentucky, basically, as our, you know, for Buffalo Trace. And once it was discovered, then the next thing you know, that's all we produced and aged it, and then we started building warehouses. Our first large warehouse, new warehouse, was built in 1870, around 1875, and then we expanded to warehouse B, which was around late 1800s, and then D was our third large warehouse, produced in 1907. And then, you know, every year as our inventory grew, we would build more warehouses, and we're up to 12 warehouses. We're using 11 of them, and we're up to 12, and we currently need another one. So, I mean, if you look back through the history, and it's interesting, as we increased in size, also the architecture changed. You know, the first warehouses were brick and built with ornate limestone windows, and you know, and as time went on, the architecture changed. You know, and we started building with blocks, and so we have the full gamut of architecture here, based on history and what was popular at the time. And come to find out, it's nice because for us, we have 13 different products, and it gives us different flavors. Each warehouse has a little different flavor. And so, and that's a nice thing, to be able to have those different architectures which create different flavors. So it works out nicely with our portfolio.
Tell me a little bit about how the different warehouses produce a different product.
Well, we have, like I say, brick and block, and we have metal clad, and all those things create different atmospheres around the barrels. And we're very careful to rick all of our barrels. And when I say rick, we put them up in a rick and lay them on their side, and we create an air pocket around every single barrel. And what that does, it allows you to manipulate basically the flavor inside that barrel. So if you have a barrel on the upper floor versus a lower floor, for instance, you're going to experience more heat, a little different humidity level, and so you're going to get a quicker aging. For us, it's going to be a quicker aging, a little hotter probably, depending on flavor, recipe too. So all these things are factors. So if you took, for instance, a wheated bourbon and put it up on the top floor, and we're going to age it for 20 years, we know that that would not be a good thing because it's aging too quickly for that product. So we would put it down on like a second floor of one of the warehouses, probably the brick warehouses or the block warehouses, where it ages pretty constantly, consistently, and over a 20-year period, it comes out a really nice flavor. And we're very careful when we put barrels away to take all those things in consideration. So somehow or another, we have to factor in the raw ingredients, the biological process that it takes to create the raw ingredients. We have to take into consideration the biological process of fermentation. We have to take into consideration the people that produce everything, which is a biological process. And then we also have to take into consideration the aging concept. And every barrel is different. The wood comes from different locations and mountains. Different levels of sun hit the tree, creating a different thickness in the wood. And all those things give it different flavors. And at the end of the day, you have to make a consistent product. So that's kind of the idea, to be able to do that. And for us, like I say, to have 13 different bourbons, we're able to select the barrels and bourbons that match each taste profile. And that's the idea.
You use the term wheated bourbon. Can you explain that?
We make 5 recipes here, and the 2 most common bourbon recipes are corn, rye, and malted barley. That's one recipe. And then you substitute and take out the rye, and so you put corn, wheat, and malted barley. And those are the 2 most common recipes out there. And so we make both, and we make different levels of each one based on which product we're producing. So we'll have a high rye or a low rye bourbon, and then we have a wheated bourbon line that we offer up. We start at 7-year-old, and we go all the way up to 23-year-old for wheat. And the wheat is traditionally a mild, sweeter bourbon. It's less spice, less sharpness. It's just overall ages better than a rye bourbon, in my opinion. So, if you ask me my favorite age for a wheated bourbon, I'd say around 12 years old. If you ask me a rye bourbon, I would say around 8 to 9, maybe even 10. But it's all based on recipe and flavor. And it depends on where it ages too, and which product it is. So,
take me through, just briefly, if you will, the process of producing bourbon. You've already discussed some matters along those lines, but from start to finish.
We used to get all of our grains in by rail, and in the about 1981, we stopped the rail from coming in. So everything is delivered by truck, by semi. And we take all of our grains, bring them in by truck, and clean all of our grains again. We order our grains clean, but we also clean them ourselves and put them into our silos and store. We try to keep 4 or 5 days of inventory on hand. And we go through, on a given run, we'll go through about 8,000 acres of corn, 2,000 or 3,000 acres of rye, 2,000 or 3,000 acres of malt. And when we go through all this grain, we get it in the silo, we'll pull it out of the silo and grind it. We grind it through a screen, and it's a 10/64 of an inch screen, or a 5/32. But we do that because we've experimented and try to go up or down on that screen size, and we do that for yield reasons and flavor. And we found that if you go too small, it makes a difference, or likewise if you go too big. So for us, that's what we settled on. And once we grind it up, we put it in our cookers, and we cook our corn separately from our small grain. We call small grain malt and rye or wheat, and we cook that up under atmospheric conditions. So we'll cook it up in a small cooker, and then we cook our corn in a pressure cooker, and then we blend those two slurries together after we get done cooking. So we cook everything up, and then it takes us about 45 minutes to cook one cook, and currently we're running 16 of those cooks a day, and we produce about 170,000 gallons of mash every day. And we take all that mash and put it in the fermenters, and at that time we start our yeasting process, where the yeast will start to grow and do its job, and we don't pay it a penny. It does all the work, and produces our alcohol for us. And we take the alcohol, once it's completed, we call it a beer. And people say, well, you're making beer. Well, we are making beer, but the difference is we have all the solids, all the grain still in there, and we don't separate those things out. So we pump all that beer through our beer still, and that's where we literally separate the good, clean alcohol from all the solids and everything left over. And so at that point, we're creating two products. We call it a setback that comes off the bottom of the still, and we call it an alcohol coming off the top, and we distill at different proofs based on our recipe. So for us, we have 5 recipes, and we have 3 main distillation proofs, and we'll come off somewhere around 135 proof off the still. And we take that good, clear, clean liquid that they used to drink in the mid-1700s, and we put that into the barrel. And then at that point, the aging process takes over. And the goal is to extract certain flavors from the barrel based on our recipe again. So that's an important step. But we also have that byproduct of setback. So we take that setback off the still, and we put that back into the fermenter, and we call that's how we sour our process. And souring is literally just dropping the pH of the fermenter. So the pH of that is about a 3.4 or 5. And we take that setback and pump it back into the fermenter and sour the mash. So that's how you start the sour mash process. And all distilleries do that. All distilleries use sour mash. And what that does, it creates a buffer in the fermenter to stop bacterial growth, undesirables from being produced in the fermenter. And then it also gives you a second shot at a little bit of starch that's left over. And it creates consistency because you're getting like flavors from batch to batch. So it's a very important step in the fermentation process. But literally what creates the flavor at the end of the day, you have raw ingredients, you have the fermentation, and you have distillation, and then you have aging. Those 4 things are the critical key ingredients for producing different flavors in bourbon. And you can vary each of those 4 things within the limits of the law. And that's how you create those different flavors.
Tell me about the yeast. Where do you get the yeast? Do you use more than one type of yeast? How do yeasts vary?
The yeast is one of the key steps in the fermentation process because the yeast is what determines how much of what alcohol is produced at what levels. So every distillery has their own strain of yeast, and we isolated our yeast in 1932, and we call it Dr. Lachey number 2. And the story is Dr. Lachey himself, who used to work here, isolated 3 different yeasts, and he liked number 2. So, you know, very scientifically, we said Dr. Lachey number 2, and it's still called that to this day. And we've kept that same strain every year because we feel like it produces a nice balance of higher alcohols, ethanol, and aldehydes and things that create the bourbon. And also esters is a key ingredient too. And we feel like it's the best overall yeast for our process. And we also only use one yeast for all of our bourbons because we're a little bit fearful of introducing other yeast for one thing, and we don't want, we guard it we have it in 5 different locations around the world, so we're very protective of this yeast. It's really our livelihood, and so it's a key step in the process.
What is an ester?
An ester is a product that's produced during fermentation that gives it a fruity character. It gives you some of the spicy notes, but ester is a key step in the process because without it, it'd be kind of a bland drink. And some people, you know, even can say they taste dark candied fruit and all these things, but I promise we don't put dark candied fruit in, but those are all things created by esters, and it's created during fermentation and then it's carried through the barrel. It doesn't change in the barrel, so those esters are enhanced by aging in the barrel.
You mentioned that several proofs off the still are used at Buffalo Trace. What are the considerations that come into choosing the proof?
The important part about proof is when you're distilling something, you have to reflux. What I mean by reflux, as you distill, some of it has to go back into the pot in order to get your proof right, and that determines flavor. So if you distill at a really high proof, for instance like vodka at 190 proof, you have to do a lot of refluxing to get that proof up high, and then when you get the proof up high, you're also reducing the amount of different flavors that are in the product because your proof is so high. There's only a few things in there, and ethanol has a very distinct flavor. It's supposed to be flavorless, but for me, it has a flavor. I mean, the flavor is flavorless, and it's kind of sweet, and it's what gives it that character. So depending on where you select your proof is what type of alcohol is going to come over. At a lower proof, you're going to get a lot heavier alcohols than you do on a higher proof. And so there's a balancing act of which one you like the best. The higher alcohols, we call them congeners in the business. And the congeners is literally what flavors the product before it goes into the barrel. And then all those things react with the extracts from the wood and create those different flavors. So, you know, we try to balance not too high, not too low, and we want it to be, you know, just right. And again, the yeast determines a lot of that too. So you have to have a balancing between the yeast and the distillation.
What would be an example of a whiskey you were trying to produce at low distillation proof?
An example of that for us would be the W.L. Weller. We have a wheated bourbon, and the design for that bourbon is to be a nice, smooth, sweet, and mild bourbon. And in order to preserve that, we give it lots of flavor with a low proof, and then we put wheat in it instead of the rye, and we age it for at least 7 years. And we have a Weller 12 too, and goes up to 12. So, you know, from the very first day of raw ingredients, distillation, fermentation, the whole thing, it's designed to produce that flavor. So that'd be an example.
What about the barrels? Are all barrels more or less the same? Are they different? Can you control that?
Yeah, the barrels actually are all exactly different. There's not one barrel that's the same, and we produce all of our barrels to one spec. We want 53-gallon barrels. We want number 4 char, which is a 55-second burn on the inside, and we feel like that's the best overall balance of flavor for our products. But all the wood is different. As I mentioned before, the tree is a very big determining factor of the flavor. The bottom of the tree might have more coconut in it than the top of the tree. The top of the tree might have more vanilla in it than the bottom of the tree. And so depending on where they slice that tree and make a stave, all those things are selected randomly and then put in to produce in a barrel. So we can pick up a barrel and age it with the very same day's production, put it in the same rick in the same warehouse on the same floor, and those two products will come out slightly different. Within the first 7 months, you're going to start picking up a little bit of different flavor, and that's really the whole genesis of single barrel bourbon. And in 1984, we launched it based on people selecting certain bourbon barrels because they liked it, and we didn't want to mix it with other barrels. And the Blanton's was our first single barrel, and that's the first one to ever hit the market. And since then, everybody's copied that. But that's the idea. You bring that one barrel that tastes that certain way, and you put it in that bottle, and don't mix it with anything else. And you offer it up as a single barrel. So it's a very super high quality bourbon that's been tasted, and we know it's good when it goes into the bottle. And that's the genesis of the whole thing, because every barrel's a little different.
So all the barrels that you receive here initially, as far as you know, are the same. There's no attempt to make different barrels different.
No.
It's just they turn out differently in the
Right.
end.
It's a complete random process, and it's white oak. It's all from a general location, mostly from Missouri, some Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana, but mostly Missouri, the Ozark Mountain region, and so it's a very isolated from a world perspective. It's kind of an isolated area, but all the wood is a little different. So it depends on soil and sun and the amount of trees that are around it, and all those things are factors. And what side of the mountain it was on is a determining factor. So no, there's no real, there's no intent to have different barrels. It's just a random process. Now, one thing we did, because we like to do a lot of experiments, and we're known to do those. We have an experimental collection that's behind me. And but one of the experiments we did was, we did that. We went out and selected certain trees, and we call it a single tree bourbon. And we went out and GPS coordinated one tree at a time. We selected them. We documented how many rings that were in that tree, what age it was, where it was on the tree. We did soil samples. We did the whole thing. And so then we took that one tree and produced a barrel from that tree, and then we're aging bourbon with it. So right now they're about 6 years old, and we're getting some very good flavors, differences between the trees. But we did 1,500 trees that way. And so we're able to, in a nice experiment, to be able to get differences in flavors. And then hopefully our idea, and I told you that earlier, is we like to be able to understand all these things that we do to create these different flavors. So we might be able to connect the tree to the different flavors in those bourbons. And then we can maybe isolate some of the flavors, based on that. And then all the bourbon manufacturers will love us because we'll order certain trees, but that's the idea.
That brings up the Buffalo Trace Experimental Collection and all of the experiments that you have done. Can you tell us a little bit more about these various experiments with bourbon production that have gone on here?
Yeah, we started a pretty heavy experimental program about 1996, and we put away a bunch of experiments based on different ideas that we had at the time, and we've launched a few of them to the public to try to get feedback across the United States, and we're trying to get feedback on some of these experiments, some of them good, some of them bad, and we kind of feel like the best bourbon has never been made, and we're still working to make the very best bourbon ever. And so we've got about 35 large experiments in the warehouse right now aging. We have about 1,500 separate barrels on those 35 experiments. And so we're able to isolate things like proof and different woods and different grains and different distillation techniques and all these different things that we've always wondered about. But the idea is for us to hone in on different flavors and be able to hopefully produce someday the best bourbon ever. But we've tried some, anything you can think of pretty much, and we literally have a list of 100 different ideas, and it's just a matter of going down and doing the list. And the problem was always that in order for us to do an experiment, our minimum batch was 65 barrels. And for us, that's a pretty large capital investment, and we're family owned, and sometimes you have to come off the hip to do it. So one of the things we did was we invested in a micro distillation process where now we can produce all the way down to 1 barrel at a time. So now literally it's a little quicker for us to do experiments, and we can produce, do many more experiments. So we have this big long list of experiments to do, and now we have the mechanism to get them done. And so it's kind of exciting, and it's something that we can do because we're privately held, and we can try to produce all these different flavors.
Is the master distiller responsible for all phases of the production of the product, or primarily responsible for the distillation phase?
At Buffalo Trace, the master distiller is responsible for everything along the way, from start all the way to the point of dumping it into the bottling tank. So you're responsible for all those those production steps and processes. Other distilleries, the master distiller might be primarily responsible for education, for instance. But here, I'm in the trenches. I'm responsible for all the work, and then I also try to do educational work too. So I try to balance those things. But yeah, we're into a lot of different things. So you're responsible for production basically of all the spirits, not only bourbon but vodka and whiskeys and anything else we produce. So my whole team of people, we have about 48 people in the distillery, and which to me is not a lot. And we together as a team produce all these different products.
So the master distiller is perhaps also in some sense the plant manager, being responsible for the whole sequence of steps from distillation through aging and dumping into the...
Yeah, if you refer to the plant as the distillery, yeah. We have a plant manager here, and he's also responsible. Not only do I report to him, but he's also responsible for distribution, shipping, and bottling. So there's more to it. At this site, and everything on this site is done here. All the shipping and bottling is all done here. So everything we produce comes from here. We have over 5.5 million cases that come out of here, and all different products. And there's lots of processes and lots of steps. And I think we're up to about 250 total employees. So out of the 250, 48 of them is on the distilling side, where we do the production of the spirit. But then there's also all the processing and bottling and shipping and all those other steps that are involved. So just depends on what you call plant, I guess.
So the aging process is also within your purview?
Yeah. Yeah, we have, like I say, luckily for me, I have two guys that have been in the distillery and in the distilling business together for 94 years. And the aging warehouse manager has been here since 1964, and the aging warehouse supervisor has been here since 1966, I think, or 65. So those two guys I rely on heavily for their experience. I bounce ideas off of them, and they're just great. And they take care of a lot of the day-to-day aging things, but it's nice to be able to draw on that experience too. And we also recently hired a aging warehouse supervisor to learn under those guys and pick up some of that institutional knowledge, and so we're kind of watching for the future too, banking on the future, so that guy can kind of take over that day-to-day operation. Buffalo Trace is a relatively new bourbon for us. We started in 1999. That was the first year it hit the shelves. In 1998, we basically had a meeting, and I was lucky enough to be kind of on the ground floor of this project. And we had a meeting and decided we're going to change the name of this distillery because nobody knew it was the Stagg Distillery, George T. Stagg Distillery. Legally, that's what it has been for a long time. And it really was a lost name. And we wanted to come up with a name that was respectful for the heritage of the distillery. I mean, this site was literally where the Buffalo crossed the Kentucky River, and the settlement known as the Leestown Settlement was settled here in 1773. And we started the distilling process with that settlement. And we've expanded this place ever since then, and we're walking on the site of the original settlers of this area. And so we really had no connection. So we said, what better name than Buffalo Trace? And so we've got this great name and this great facility. What kind of bourbon are we going to put in it? And so we invited 15 retired individuals, 15 people from the plant, and we sat down and did some tasting, and we voted basically on what bourbon we want to represent Buffalo Trace. And so we all voted, and we came up with this 8-year-old small batch bourbon. Not much of it out. There's not much small batches out there. But for us, small batches is 40 barrels or less. And for that, we're able to really have tight reins on the flavor. And we felt like 8 years old was the best overall flavor for a rye bourbon. We chose rye because of the spiciness, the flavor profile. You know, it just had a nice, smooth, nice kick. 90 proof because we feel like that's Kentucky proof. It's strong. All those things are selected for a reason. And it's the best overall bourbon, everyday bourbon. So we selected the bourbon, and then the next thing was package. What kind of package do we put this in? We wanted it to be in a nice new bottle, new style, but still kind of respectful of the other bottles out there. So we came up with the bottle that we have, and then the label itself we voted on by the employees here. So we'd isolated it down to 5 labels, and then we had all the employees come in at lunchtime. And I remember we voted for which of those 5 labels we liked the best. And at the end of the day, this is the label that we came up with. And that bottle represents this distillery. And that's the way we came up with the product in the first place. Now the next thing is, how do you make it consistent? So we make this first batch, and we love it. We think it's great. So the next batch we produce, we go out and select 40 barrels, and we taste them. And then we compare those 40 barrels to that very first batch. And we've been doing that ever since 1999. We took that first batch and we saved a bunch of samples, and then we use that as our standard. And then we compare every single batch to that very first batch taste profile. And we still do that. And so we're able to be very consistent and offer up, you know, if you taste a bottle now, it should taste very, very close to the very first batch we ever produced. And like I say, it's a best overall representation of the distillery, and it pays homage to all the heritage here and all the people and all the employees. So we're very proud of it, in case you can't tell.
When you do the tasting, who actually is involved in the tasting process?
We have a tasting panel, tasting professionals, myself, and at least 4 others taste in the laboratory, and we'll get those 40 barrels and put them on a table. And the nice thing about that is we don't argue amongst each other. If one person out of the 4 or 5 or 6 that taste that has an issue with that one barrel, we turn it and it's out. And there's no arguing. You know, if you don't like that taste profile for any reason, or you don't think it matches the original, we turn it and it's over. And I like it because it's 100%. It's either all good or, you know, there's a difference. We haven't made bad bourbon, it's just a little different sometimes. So the nice thing is, if a person's off sick or out, then you still have that nice panel to be able to taste those. But we have a group of individuals that do that. It's kind of how we do all of our projects, by the way. You know, it's a team effort. Right now we're using 3 of our 11 warehouses for Buffalo Trace, and we try to stay in the middle floors because we feel like that's kind of the average. It experiences the most overall differences in weather And so you get a lot of nice aging, and it's not too much over the top at the top floors. It's not too little at the bottom. So it's really kind of a representative of the best average bourbon, that, you know, best average flavor, I should say. Hopefully it's not an average bourbon.
In modern times, the master distiller often is the public face behind the product. How do you spend your time in that particular, position?
We do that as much as we can. I have traveled across the United States and some across the pond to promote and educate about Buffalo Trace and all of our products. And I do that as much as possible. I probably average 1 or 2 trips a month, and most of the time it's an overnight trip or something, because I do try to stay really close to the operation and make sure nothing happens. You know, I kind of feel like, on that note, I kind of feel like, you know, I've got the baton that's been passed to me. I'm the 6th distiller since the Civil War, and I've got the baton now, and I have to carry it, and so I have to make sure everything's done right. And so I watch that really closely, but I also go out and try to educate. And we do a lot of bourbon dinners and bourbon tastings, and try to show people the differences that are out there. And, you know, believe it or not, there are people that don't know what bourbon is, and it's hard for me to understand, but there's 80% of the general public don't know what bourbon is across the United States. And that's something that's nice, because there's a untapped market out there that people who have not experienced bourbon. And so the education piece is important, to be able to teach people what an American spirit is, what they're missing, and how to appreciate some of these drinks. And you know, I get excited about that stuff. I like doing that, and it's kind of the perk of the job, to be able to explain, you know, and brag about the guys in the distillery and all the things we do here. So I enjoy that part of it.
Speaking of education, I was recently in a pub in Ireland, and I saw on the wall a list of their spirits available, which included American whiskeys, and the list of American whiskeys included Canadian Club and Southern Comfort.
There you go.
Now, what's your reaction to that?
Well, believe it or not, you don't have to go to Ireland. I mean, you know, I do it all the time, and not so much in Kentucky, but a lot in Kentucky. You can go in and say, what kind of bourbon do you have? And they say, oh, we got anything you want. We got Jack, we got Crown, you know, we got some Jim Beam or something like that. So that's part of the education process, to explain to people the difference between a Canadian whiskey and a Tennessee whiskey and a bourbon. And one of the things we like about having a bourbon is that there are regulations. You know, there's certain things you have to do to produce a bourbon, and so that kind of keeps a nice rein on what's going on. But you know, it's all about educating and teaching people how, you know, the differences in the whiskeys and the products out there. The experimental collection has nothing to do with money, because if we did it for money, we wouldn't do it. The experimental collection for us is literally to go out and find the best overall flavor that we can find, and what are the factors that go into creating those flavors. And so for us, it's 100% educational, and being able to get feedback from customers and from people to get excited about the products and understand why we do what we do. And so really, it's all about education and learning, and being professionals in the trade, and being able to really have a firm handle on what we do for a living. So it has nothing to do with money. And we hear about that. You know, people, why would you do that if you can't make any money? And really, it's not about that. And I said that earlier, we're lucky to be able to do those things, because we are privately held, and we can make those decisions based on trying to produce these different products. And like I say, education and learning about the products that we produce. So it's all about that. I haven't told a lot of people this, but in high school, my worst subject was chemistry. And I did very well in every subject except chemistry. And it literally, to me, was a challenge. And I said when I went to college, there was lots of options. And I have two bachelors. My first bachelor is in chemistry. And I said, when I get to college, I'm going to lick this thing because I was kind of competitive. I'm still competitive anyway. And, so my worst subject, I decided that's going to be my major. And I got a bachelor's in chemistry from Northern Kentucky University. And then I knew I didn't really want to work in a lab the rest of my life. And so I went into chemical engineering and I went to UK, and I started that in 1991, I think, and went down and started engineering school there and got a bachelor's in chemical engineering. So it was nice because I had all this chemistry background and understood chemistry pretty well at that point, and I was able to, it actually, I think, helped me in the engineering side because the first couple years, we're teaching you about chemical reactions and things. So I had a pretty good handle on that stuff, and it really kind of helped me get a head start. But the engineering side is really what excited me. I love engineering and all the things that you have to do to be an engineer. So lots of options out there, but growing up in this area, knowing about the whiskey industry in general, there was a position that came available after I graduated, working under the Master Distiller and in an apprenticeship basically. And then once he retired, then I would, if everything worked out, I would take his job. So for me, it was a perfect opportunity. The chemical engineering is perfect for this position because you're using a lot of the engineering and a lot of the chemistry. And I learned about separations and distillation and all those things before I got here. So it really helped me get a head start on learning the day-to-day activity. But really, you don't learn the distilling process for spirits until you get on the job because there's so many different things that you have to learn. And you have to learn about this plant and how things operate and why things do what they do. And you never really stop learning. I asked the guy before me, his name was Gary Gayhart, and he worked here for, I think, 36 years. Started in 1969, which was the year I was born. And he worked the same length of time as his predecessor, which I thought was unusual. But I asked Gary right before he left, and I said, do you ever stop learning? And he said no. He learned stuff every day just like I did, and it was nice because we would bounce ideas off each other. And I worked for him for 10 years, and it was a great relationship. He was an awesome guy to work for, an awesome distiller, knows his stuff. And it was great for me because I drew from all this great experience, just like with Ronnie. And I'm able to take all this great experience and blend it with some of the new technologies and new ways of doing things and so on. So I had a pretty good setup. It was all by design. I chose those things, but it's a pretty good setup. And so once Gary retired in 2005, early 2005, then they named me the Master Distiller. So.
Distilling legend Pappy Van Winkle once famously said that no chemists were allowed at his distillery in Louisville.
Yeah.
How do you react to that?
Well, it's all, and that's just exactly what you said, legend, because everybody knows you have to have a chemist. And, that statement literally means that at the end of the day, it's all about taste and flavor. And you can analyze and figure out chemical compounds and esters and talk about aldehydes and all these things. But at the end of the day, it's all about how does it taste on your palate. So you could get away without a chemist, but it's nice to have that chemist backing you up saying, well, this is the reason why you taste the way it does, and this is how you make it a consistent product. And so, that statement means a lot, actually. It means that You know, the focus is on flavor and making customers happy, and the chemist is not a necessity on the day that you taste it. But when you're producing stuff, it's nice to have that chemist to help you produce a consistent product. So every distillery has one. I can tell you that. And even back then they had one. So
Bourbon is obviously a product of great tradition, but also there are innovations, as you've discussed, that affect the product and will continue to affect the product in the future. Where would you like to see bourbon go in the future in terms of either taste profile or marketing or production?
well, I think, you know, to be honest, I've been pretty happy with the path that bourbon is taking, because I think bourbon has taken kind of the high road. People look at it as a product that has a lot of quality. And it's all about time and technique, and so I think for everything that I've seen out on the market, that's kind of what people are using as the selling point. And I think it's in the right direction. I think as we go on and we educate all these people that are uneducated about bourbon, I think as long as we stick to the high road, then I think we're gonna be on the right path. I think it's a product kind of like the Scotch industry that is going to be around forever. I mean, I just don't see a product being faded out or a fad. I think once people understand bourbon, they're on it for life, and there's a reason for that. And so I think we're on the right track. I'd like to see more education. I'd like to see not necessarily commercials, but I'd like for people to understand there is an alternative to beer and wine and all these other drinks that they're having. And so that's what I like to see, to be able to walk into a bar and order a bourbon, and they say, okay, we've got Jim Beam, we've got Buffalo Trace, and we've got Wild Turkey, and we've got these bourbon. You know, they know what they're talking about. That's really what I like to see, and I think someday we'll get there, you know.
Speaking of this, at least imaginary history of Buffalo Trace Distillery, imagine such a history written 50 years in the future, which among other things described your tenure here as Master Distiller. What ideally would you like to see written about you in such a book?
I'd like to see that in 50 years that they say that he was an extreme professional, and he maintained and improved the distillery and carried the torch well. And really that's all you can ask for. At the end of the day, as long as it was a little better than when I left it, than when I started, then I think I've done something. And this place, like I say, has been here for so long that if you can have a little improvement in a chunk of that time, then I think it's kind of a fortunate thing. So that would be what I hope they would say, that he made a very nice, consistent product, and improved the distillery overall.